If an operator can make you angry, excited, fearful, or desperate for approval, they own you. Right now, your decisions, your body language, and your life's trajectory are being held hostage by microsurges of neurochemistry that you falsely label as your feelings. In behavioral profiling and situational dynamics, emotional reactivity is the ultimate structural flaw. When you react emotionally to an event, a comment, or a confrontation, you instantly leak operational control. You broadcast your internal vulnerabilities, hand your leverage over to the room, and become completely predictable to anyone who knows how to read human behavior. Most people spend their entire lives reacting to every external stimulus that crosses their radar. They let a sharp word ruin their morning, a sudden setback trigger panic, or a brief moment of rejection collapse their posture. They are passive passengers trapped in a chaotic cycle of chemical highs and lows. If you exit this video right now, you will remain entirely manageable, a reactive entity whose actions can be calculated, manipulated, and neutralized by anyone who understands how to press your buttons. Stay right here. Over the next few minutes, we will break down the exact behavioral mechanics of emotional detachment, teach you how to sever the connection between stimulus and response, and install an impenetrable psychological frame that converts you into an unshakable, sovereign operator in any environment. In high-stakes behavioral profiling, we do not evaluate people by their intentions, their intelligence, or their verbal claims. We profile them by their level of emotional volatility. The moment you allow an external event to trigger an uncontrolled emotional response, your physiology betrays you. Your vocal pitch shifts, your blink rate spikes, your microexpressions leak hesitation, and your physical frame collapses. To an observer trained in behavioral mechanics, these subtle nonverbal signals are open doors. Your emotional spikes tell the world exactly where you are weak, where your insecurities lie, and how much pressure is required to break your composure. To gain true situational control, you must execute a ruthless protocol. You must kill your emotional reactivity before it kills your authority. Modern culture preaches that expressing every passing feeling is a sign of authenticity and strength. In operational reality, it is a catastrophic weakness. Feelings are simply primitive neurochemical signals designed to ensure biological survival in primitive environments. They are volatile, short-sighted, and fundamentally irrational. When you allow fear, anger, or sudden enthusiasm to dictate your choices, you are allowing ancient brain hardware to run high-status, modern operations. You are forfeiting cold analytical logic in favor of temporary chemical impulses. An operator who seeks true authority treats emotions not as sacred truths, but as internal noise that must be filtered out to maintain clear situational awareness. The distance between an external event and your physical response is where your ultimate leverage resides. When a low-value operator attempts to provoke you, or when a high-friction crisis strikes, your primitive brain attempts to bypass conscious thought and fire off an immediate emotional reaction. The key to absolute neutrality lies in creating an immediate micro-intervention. You breathe, freeze your vocal delivery, hold your physical frame completely still, and observe the internal chemical spike without yielding to it. You force your mind to analyze the situation objectively. What is happening? What is the objective data? What is the most high-leverage response? By starving the emotion of physical movement and verbal expression, you neutralize its power instantly. Most people do not actually want emotional peace. They are neurochemically addicted to chaos and validation. They seek out arguments, nurse grudges, overthink social interactions, and project dramatic narratives onto mundane events, because their nervous system craves the dopamine and cortisol hits that accompany emotional turmoil. They mistake emotional intensity for living fully. To build an impenetrable baseline, you must undergo a total psychological detox. You must cultivate a ruthless indifference to low-value conflicts, superficial provocations, and the desperate urge to defend your ego. When you stop feeding the drama, you reclaim vast reserves of mental bandwidth that can be directed toward relentless execution. Killing your emotions does not mean you stop perceiving reality. It means you finally see reality without distortion. When you strip away judgment, offense, fear, and wishful thinking, you are left with pure, unvarnished data. You see people for who they actually are based on their micro-behaviors, not who you hope they will be. You assess risk with objective mathematical clarity rather than emotional anxiety. You operate with a calm, surgical precision that allows you to maneuver through high-stress environments while everyone around you is collapsing under the weight of their own internal panic. When you master the art of emotional detachment, you become an immovable force in any social or professional dynamic. You cannot be baited into pointless arguments. You cannot be manipulated through guilt, flattery, or fear. Your presence projects an underlying, unshakable stillness that commands immediate respect from high-status operators and deeply unsettling caution from those who seek to manipulate you. Hold your frame, refuse to surrender your baseline to passing feelings, and establish yourself as an absolute sovereign force that operates strictly on logic, discipline, and non-negotiable standards. Emotional neutrality as ultimate tactical leverage represents a complete paradigm shift from passive emotional suppression to the active surgical control of your internal nervous system. Far too many individuals confuse killing emotions with becoming a cold, unfeeling sociopath or pretending that internal friction does not exist. In behavioral profiling and high-stakes human mechanics, emotional neutrality is not about the complete eradication of human sensation. It is about severing the immediate link between an internal neurochemical surge and your outward physical posture. When an external event, a hostile provocation, or a high-stress crisis occurs, your primitive brain naturally releases cortisol, adrenaline, and dopamine to force a rapid survival response. The untrained individual immediately surrenders their frame to this chemical spike, allowing fleeting feelings of panic, anger, or offense to dictate their vocal tone, facial expressions, and tactical choices. An operator trained in situational authority understands that yielding to this automatic loop instantly strips you of your leverage, signaling to the entire environment that your internal state can be effortlessly manipulated by external inputs. To weaponize emotional neutrality, you must recognize that unchecked reactivity is a massive structural vulnerability that surrounding operators will exploit to profile, predict, and control your behavior. The moment you react emotionally to a statement or situation, you leak critical operational data about your insecurities, your ego, and your pressure points. A skilled profiler does not need to interrogate you to discover your weaknesses. They simply drop a deliberate provocation into the conversation and observe how your body language shifts, how your blink rate spikes, and how rapidly you move to defend your ego. When you collapse into emotional reactivity, you hand over the steering wheel of the interaction to whoever provoked you, transforming yourself from an active controller of the dynamic into a predictable, easily managed variable. By maintaining absolute neutrality under fire, you present an impenetrable, opaque facade that starves the observer of feedback, leaving them unable to gauge your intentions, locate your boundaries, or calculate your next move. Furthermore, stripping external events of their power to hijack your autonomic nervous system gives you an overwhelming cognitive advantage over everyone else in the room. In high-friction scenarios, The vast majority of people lose their capacity for higher-level rational thought because their brains are flooded with emotional noise. Their perception narrows, the decision-making becomes impulsive, and they begin prioritizing short-term emotional relief over long-term strategic victory. Emotional neutrality acts as a cognitive filter that isolates pure, unvarnished analytical data from the surrounding chaos. You stop viewing events through the distorting lens of personal offense, fear, or wishful thinking, and begin viewing them with cold, surgical clarity. You assess physical realities, power dynamics, and risk metrics as they actually exist, enabling you to execute precise, calculated decisions while those around you are collapsing under the weight of their own internal turmoil. Ultimately, establishing emotional neutrality as your default operational baseline builds an unshakable aura of situational dominance that naturally commands respect. When surrounding operators realize that their attempts to bait, intimidate, or flatter you yield zero nonverbal or verbal feedback, the dynamic shifts entirely in your favor. Your calm, unhurried demeanor communicates absolute confidence and sovereignty, signaling that your internal state is anchored so deeply within your own standards that no external turbulence can disturb it. You stop wasting valuable mental bandwidth on defensive arguments, emotional recovery, and ego validation, directing 100% of your focus toward observing the environment, identifying leverage points, and executing your strategy with relentless, silent discipline. The deception of emotional reactivity is rooted in the modern cultural delusion that broadcasting your internal state is a profound expression of authenticity and strength. In the cold, unvarnished reality of human dynamics and behavioral profiling, wearing your emotions on your sleeve is the equivalent of broadcasting your tactical coordinates to an adversarial force. Every time you display unchecked fear, sudden anger, uncalibrated attachment, or a desperate, lingering need for social validation, you are not being authentic. You are leaking raw, unencrypted data from your autonomic nervous system. These emotions are primitive, highly predictable biological reflexes, and when you allow them to dictate your outward behavior, you hand surrounding operators the exact psychological blueprints required to bypass your logic and hijack your decision-making process. You voluntarily degrade your status from an autonomous, sovereign operator to a highly reactive, easily managed variable within their environment. To an individual trained to read behavioral mechanics, your emotional volatility functions as a high-definition dashboard displaying your deepest psychological vulnerabilities. They do not need to subject you to prolonged interrogation to map your internal architecture. They simply drop a calculated stimulus into your environment, a subtle slight, an ambiguous text message, or a heavy dose of unexpected praise, and watch how your physiology betrays your baseline. The moment your ego perceives a threat, the neurochemical flood instantly alters your nonverbal baseline. Your blink rate spikes, your vocal pitch tightens, microtensions ripple across your jawline, and your posture stiffens defensively. These nonverbal leaks are not just signs of discomfort, they are the literal language of exploitation. By observing the precise moments you lose your temper, a profiler learns exactly what you fear losing. By observing what makes you eager to comply, they discover the exact currency of validation you have been starved of. Once your emotional triggers are cataloged, an external operator possesses the capability to steer your trajectory with invisible precision, weaponizing your own neurochemistry against you. Anger is perhaps the most easily exploited vulnerability because the adrenaline surge intentionally bypasses the prefrontal cortex, completely shutting down your capacity for high-level strategic thought. If an operator wants you to make a catastrophic, unforced error in a negotiation or a relationship, they do not need to outmaneuver your intellect. They only need to insult your competence. Knowing your fragile ego will force you into a blind, aggressive overreaction that ruins your leverage. In this state, you believe you are defending your honor, completely oblivious to the fact that you are executing the exact script they wrote for you. Similarly, attachment and the desperate need for validation represent massive structural flaws in your psychological armor. When you require external approval to maintain your internal baseline, you give the surrounding environment absolute control over your self-worth. Manipulators will exploit this by flooding your system with the exact praise and attention your neurochemistry craves, establishing a deep artificial dependency. Once your baseline is hooked on their validation, they will systematically execute a pattern of abrupt withdrawal, plunging your nervous system into acute anxiety. Because your brain is terrified of losing that external supply, you will unconsciously compromise your boundaries, lower your standards, and perform increasingly desperate behaviors just to restore the dopamine hit of their favor. You function entirely as a puppet to their calculated emotional withholding, convinced that you are acting out of loyalty or love when, in reality, you are simply responding to a manufactured chemical deficit. Operating under the delusion that unchecked feelings are a natural part of the human experience leaves you in a perpetual state of defensive reactivity, bouncing blindly from one emotional extreme to another, completely unaware that as long as any operator with a passing insult or a cheap compliment can breach your perimeter and alter your heart rate, you possess zero true agency. The micro-intervention protocol is the operational weapon that breaks the automated biological bridge between sensory stimulus and physiological response. When an unexpected crisis strikes, a hostile operator attempts a social breach, or an internal surge of panic threatens to break your posture, your primitive limbic system instantly fires a cascade of neurochemicals designed to trigger a rapid fight or flight reaction. The average individual surrenders immediately to this chemical flood, allowing the spike of cortisol and adrenaline to dictate their vocal tone, facial expressions, and tactical choices within milliseconds. This rapid, unthinking surrender is where all leverage, status, and authority are permanently lost. The micro-intervention protocol establishes a hard, non-negotiable psychological buffer directly between the incoming environmental input and your physical output. It forces a deliberate gap in time, a fraction of a second to several seconds, where you consciously seize control of your nervous system and systematically neutralize the emotional charge before it ever manifests as outward behavior. Executing this protocol requires immediate, hyper-aware bodily intervention the second an external trigger enters your orbit. The moment your mind registers a threat, an insult, or an unexpected setback, your first action is not to speak, defend yourself, or move defensively. Your first action is total physical stillness. You consciously lock your physical frame, maintain steady, unblinking eye contact, and instantly regulate your respiration by taking a slow, diaphragmatic breath to suppress the automatic spike in your heart rate. This physical stillness sends a powerful reverse signal down the vagus nerve directly to your brain, forcefully countermanding the limbic system's attempt to initiate an emergency stress response. By refusing to let your jaw tighten, your hands fidget, or your vocal pitch elevate, you effectively starve the chemical surge of the physical feedback loop it requires to take full control of your mind. During this enforced pause, you transition your cognitive focus entirely away from emotional interpretation and move it directly into cold, analytical observation. Instead of allowing your internal dialogue to spin off into defensive rationalization, personal offense, or panic, you treat the incoming stimulus as completely neutral, unencrypted data. You ask yourself a series of rapid, objective profiling questions. What is the actual, unvarnished physical data of this situation? What is the underlying motive of the operator attempting to provoke me? What response yields the maximum tactical leverage, and what response would represent a low-status collapse of my frame? By systematically forcing your prefrontal cortex to run these analytical routines under fire, you actively reclaim your rational dominance, transforming an event designed to destabilize you into an opportunity to observe and analyze your environment. Mastering this micro-intervention protocol permanently alters how you move, communicate, and command space in high-pressure social and operational environments. When surrounding operators drop a calculated provocation or attempt to press your psychological boundaries, they expect an immediate, predictable reaction, a defensive explanation, an angry outburst, or a nervous, submissive collapse. When you respond instead with absolute physical stillness, a measured vocal delivery, and an unhurried, calm cadence, you create an intense, uncomfortable silence that completely shatters their expectations. This deliberate withholding of emotional feedback destabilizes the provoker, forcing them to confront the stark realization that their tools of influence have zero effect on your baseline. By installing this hard operational buffer, you protect your psychological perimeter, maintain total situational authority, and ensure that every action you take is a deliberate, high-leverage choice rather than a sloppy, automated reaction to passing neurochemical noise. Dismantling emotional identity requires confronting the dangerous illusion that your temporary neurochemical surges define who you are at your core. The overwhelming majority of individuals live in a state of perpetual psychological confusion because they treat fleeting feelings of fear, anger, insecurity, or enthusiasm as sacred expressions of their true self. In behavioral profiling and high-level human dynamics, we recognize that an emotion is nothing more than a transient biological event, a temporary flush of hormones and neurotransmitters designed by primitive evolutionary processes to signal perceived threats or opportunities. When you mistake these passing neurochemical blips for your actual identity, you merge your core self with volatile, short-sighted biological impulses. You give every passing mood absolute veto power over your long-term plans, allowing temporary internal turbulence to completely alter your direction, undermine your discipline, and destroy your operational baseline. This fusion of emotion and identity creates a deeply fragile, highly erratic behavioral pattern that makes sustained execution virtually impossible. When an individual adopts an emotional state as a personal label, declaring "I am anxious," "I am angry," or "I am hopeless," they convert a temporary physiological sensation into a permanent structural reality. The moment you define yourself by an emotion, your subconscious mind goes to work enforcing that identity, seeking out environmental confirmation, and generating micro-behaviors that keep you trapped within that exact chemical baseline. If a high-friction challenge arises, you do not analyze the obstacle objectively. You look at it through the lens of your adopted emotional identity, convincing yourself that your hesitation, avoidance, or retreat is a natural, authentic expression of who you are. You effectively validate your own weakness, using your feelings as a shield to justify a complete collapse of discipline and personal accountability. To reclaim your internal authority, you must execute a hard, permanent separation between the observer, your conscious analytical mind, and the emotional data flowing through your nervous system. You must cultivate the psychological distance required to observe an internal chemical surge without claiming ownership of it or allowing it to touch your physical posture. When fear spikes or anger flares during a high-stakes moment, an operator who has dismantled emotional identity does not say, "I am terrified" or "I am furious." They acknowledge the biological event objectively. My nervous system is currently experiencing a spike in adrenaline. This subtle shift in internal framing completely alters the balance of power. By treating the emotion as an external environmental variable rather than a core component of your identity, you strip it of its authority to dictate your choices. You recognize that you can feel intense internal discomfort, acute anxiety, or deep frustration while simultaneously maintaining a calm frame, speaking in a measured vocal tone, and executing your objective with surgical precision. Dismantling emotional identity allows you to build an unshakable, non-negotiable baseline that remains completely immune to internal neurochemical weather. Just as a seasoned captain does not alter their ultimate destination every time a sudden rainstorm passes over the vessel, a sovereign operator does not allow passing feelings to alter their commitment to their standards. You learn to let emotional surges rise, peak, and dissolve harmlessly in the background, while your conscious mind remains fixed entirely on high-level strategy and execution. You stop treating your feelings as trusted advisors or mandates for action, recognizing them instead as mere internal noise that must be filtered out. By refusing to let temporary neurochemical spikes dictate your permanent trajectory, you step into absolute self-mastery, commanding your nervous system with cold, unyielding authority, regardless of the internal or external friction you encounter.